Hello everybody, welcome to another Inkarnate live stream. Today we are going to be making campsites with the Fantasy Battlemap style. Campsites are, of course, a staple of any campaign, wilderness or otherwise, so of course we should totally cover them. Now if you want to follow along on today's stream, feel free to clone and edit the map. It's provided in the chat. If you're watching on YouTube, it'll be in that video description, so I'll go ahead and add that. Check the chat, go ahead, clone and edit that map to follow along, alright? Alright, campsites. As always, when you're working on any map, doesn't matter what style it is, what kind of map you're making, you first always want to do process. It's always nice to know the kind of order of operation you're going to go when you're working on a map. So of course, I always start every single map with scale. Scale is totally important. The way that you go about doing scale is using the grid. The grid is an absolute must. It's incredibly useful. It's useful for lining things up. It's useful for using scale and a whole host of other things. So scale is important, and we're going to start first with what is the scale, and then we're going to go with 5 square feet per square, and the grid that I've used is 20 by 15. That means there's going to be 100 feet by 75 feet. That adds lots of room for players to move around, maneuver, and kind of do all this fun stuff, so there's plenty of room. And then also, now that I've set that scale, I can now decide what size the stamps will be. So clearly I'm not going to have a horse that's 20 squares wide, because that would be many feet. That'd be a huge horse. It'd be a giga horse. And there's nothing wrong with that. So once you've set scale with the grid, then you can go ahead and go on to the next step, which is making the campsite or the camp area itself. Now, normally I would start with terrain, but because we're doing a camp, I actually like to make the camp scene or the camp part first. And you start the camp with the fire, of course, the campfire. So we'll go ahead and open up that real quick. And you start with the campfire first. And remember, you've got that grid on, and the grid is extremely helpful. I can place it right inside, so you have this nice large fire, and then I can decide to place the other items that are in the campsite or around the fire pit. One of them is going to be sitting logs, places for your players to sit down, okay? And also they can pick up stuff like logs, or maybe you pick up a rock or pick up a flaming stick and use it to fight. So having these parts are really nice to make your encounter that's going to take place on this map more eventful and more interesting. And then let's also add a log pile as well, because that's where all the logs are going to go inside of. So now that I put together that part, then I got to do that next part, which is, do I want tents? Do I want bedrolls? And the way to decide whether you want to use tents or bedrolls for any campsite is going to be weather, the climate, the terrain, right? If it's a nice warm night, it's not raining, maybe you want to have bedrolls around the fireplace, or around the fireplace, around the fire pit or the campfire, right? If it's cold, if it's wet, if it's damp, then maybe you should use tents instead. So deciding whether to use bedrolls or tents or both really depends on the climate of the area that your camp's at, okay? All right, so now that we've added that, let's throw in tents. So we're gonna end up going with bedrolls, but let's throw in tents. And I've just lined them up with the grid. And of course, it's somewhat ringing where the fireplace is, that way where the fire is, and that way that heat can go inside of those tents and keep you nice and warm. Okay. All right. Now, if you're wondering about how do I make tent interiors, it's not that complex. Okay, let's say that you want your players to enter into the tent and you want to see inside of it. Maybe there's something you have to grab. What I do is I just take that same tent and I drop the brightness to 0, and then I bring it down a layer, and then I put the items inside the tent on top of it or below it, depending if there's a light source in it or not. Notice this one right here has a light source inside of it. Place the items that you want in the tent. So I placed items inside of this tent and items inside of this tent. So it's not complex. Just take a tent, drop the brightness to 0, and then you can place items above or below the stamp depending if there's a light source. Okay? So we're going to stick with, I'm going to go ahead and put the exterior back, and we're going to go ahead and instead use bedrolls, because I kind of like that outdoor feeling when you're going camping. So we'll go ahead and remove the tent And let's go with bedrolls instead. So I'll turn on the bedrolls, and just like the tents, they're kind of ringing around the fire, and that way it's keeping those players nice and warm. It's giving light to that area. So it's kind of important to have kind of where you're sitting, where you're eating, cooking, everything is close to the fire. You don't want any of your stuff to wander too far away from the fire, okay? So after bedrolls, we're going to go into terrain, okay? I'm going to go ahead and turn the grid off for right now. And I want to talk just a little bit about terrain and how to go about doing it. And really, there's a whole host of options. Once you've kind of created that main camping area right here like this, you can group it, rotate it, move it around anywhere that you want, okay? I'm having it a little off-center where the fire is because I like that off-center feel. It's a campsite. So for me, the focal point is going to be the camp. But you can put your camp area anywhere that you want on the canvas. It doesn't really matter, okay? You just have to decide for yourself. Let's go over how to decide what kind of terrain that you want, okay? Terrain can be complex, but it depends on the campaign. Let's say you're like a wilderness campaign where you're in a glade, which is an opening in a forest, and so you're kind of surrounded in this clearing, kind of surrounded by trees, okay? Let's say that you wanted to do that. Okay, so everything we're outside of that yellow right there is going to be trees. Okay, or if you wanted to be maybe next to a river, like this, and maybe put a little boat or something along the creek or river, you can do that. Okay, so it's really, there's a couple options here. Maybe you want to be on top of a hill that spirals upward, right? Maybe you want to be alongside a lake. The lake just being on this side right here, and maybe some more cliffs along here. So once you've kind of put the campsite up, now it's kind of easier to decide where the terrain is going to go around the campsite, okay? That's helpful for me at least, because the campsite is the focal point. Okay, let's go over what kind of terrain layout that I am going to use. I gave you some examples, but the terrain I'm going to end up using is lake and with a forest, because we just released this new trees, forest, shrub, and those other plants for the Fantasy Battlemap style. So it's a perfect time to use those awesome detailed trees. Okay. So first you see that I have some water over here. This is going to be where the lake is. It's interactive. Players can fight along the lake shore as they push players into, or push monsters or characters into the lake, or vice versa. So having a little bit of water there also acts as a water source, and it contrasts with land, making your terrain more dynamic. And you're going to see there are the cliff right here and a cliff right here. And we're going to, these little dotted lines right here represent where our trees are going to be. So first, I will go ahead and turn on the foreground and the background. Now, if you're curious about how I did the texturing, I got a whole section coming up on how to do texturing. Okay, so just wait for that. All right. Okay, let's go ahead and put down the terrain first. We've kind of decided the kind of terrain that we want, and you'll see it's next in the list after the camp. You put down terrain stamps. Okay, so let's go ahead and put down that terrain. I'm going to go ahead and open it up. First one, let's go ahead and do our cliffs first. So I'll throw in these cavern-like stamps right here. This works great to show kind of a slope instead of like a drop-off cliff. And then I'll use another cliff stamp to kind of create the drop off into the lake, because it's still a little bit of there's no shore there. It's more like a drop off, a cliff that goes into the lake. And then of course you'll want to throw in your trees. And one thing I want to mention about the trees is you really want to show that the trees have height. You really want to lay in thick the object shadow. Use a black object shadow. Make sure the shadow has no X and Y offset. Set those offsets to 0. Well, let's go ahead and open up a tree real quick so you can kind of see it for yourselves. So if I open up a tree like this, you're going to notice that my object shadow is big. It's dark because it's kind of creating the illusion of depth. Contrast is the trick to depth. Okay, so if you have a dark thick shadow beneath a stamp, it's going to create this illusion that it is higher up. It's creating this depth. That's the trick to depth. So if you ever want to show that there's a really deep canyon or some cliffs where there's a deep, steep pitch going down, dark shadows work as using contrast is really how you get those to look like there's depth. Super important that you absolutely do this, okay? We can go ahead and remove now, and I absolutely love the new trees. Hey, first time chatter, I love the new trees. They are fabulous. I love them. And we're going to be showing more stamps too as well. Let's also include ground cover because we also added some new plants with some beautiful flowers on them. There's some white ones right here. And you'll notice that I have some right here as well that have the red, maybe some berries or some kind of fruit that grows on those trees, or maybe it's just a red flower. But adding in some shrub or ground cover looks really nice. Just be sure that your trees are the tree layer, all the trees that you have, are a layer above the ground cover, because it doesn't make any sense to have the ground cover above the trees, right? The ground cover is on the ground while the trees hover above the ground. So just keep that in mind. And I try to group everything so it stays on one layer, and then I can stack those on top of each other. So layering is super important. I'm also going to throw in a more advanced technique that I use, which is I like to use paths to create shadows. And creating shadows with the path tool is not complex. You just need to take a path, set it to black, set the shadow to black, blur it, and then drop the opacity and the width as you see fit. So when I'll go ahead and turn off that shadow so you can see it real quick. Notice that when I turn it on, it creates a little bit of a shadow here, creating this illusion of a little bit of depth right there. So path tool for life, it's more than just for connecting your points of interest, right? So now that we've added all that stuff together, let's go ahead and turn off our terrain layout. We're not needing that anymore. Let's talk about encounter, the next step in the list, which is encounter. And that means the items that you're going to throw down around the campsite that players can interact with, whether it's some fallen logs, rocks, a well, any of these things that your players can interact with in the campsite. Because if they're just running around the camp on a flat area with no interesting terrain or interesting things to interact with, combat can get really stale, kind of boring that way. So in the encounter category, we're going to throw in a couple things here. The first one is access. How is it that players get up from this road right here up to the campsite? So access is going to be the staircase right here. I've set it to the luminosity blend mode so that way it picks up whatever textures are beneath it. And then I've added some vines to it to give it a more organic feel to it. So there's a nice staircase with some vines leading up to the campsite. You need to have some kind of access to the campsite. How do they get there? Is it a road? Is it a staircase? Whatever it might be, how is it that they get to it? Okay, let's also add in some more things that you can interact with. I'm going to go ahead and turn the grid on too, so you can see that when I'm placing items on the map, I do line them up with the grid so that it's more clear, like, oh, are they half on the stump? Are they fully on the stump? So lining things up with that grid is really helpful. So let's throw in some logs that maybe players can run across. Gives them a little bit more height. Maybe it's easier to see something. Maybe you corner an enemy up against the log and they trip over the log, and then you go in for the final blow. It's something that the players can interact with. So absolutely throw in, whether it's stumps, fallen trees that's overgrown, whatever it might be. Maybe some rocks, for instance, is a great thing that players can use. Players can climb up the rock and maybe come down with a downward thrust. Maybe the arrows will shoot a little bit farther. Maybe they have some better view to see where the enemies are around the campsite. So definitely height, whether it's on top of a log, a stump, a rock, all very, very helpful. You want an encounter that's going to be unique, going to be different. It's going to have things that you can interact with. Notice how there's little rocks everywhere. Players can pick up a rock and maybe throw it at an enemy, or vice versa. So having that in is nice too. And you can throw other things too, like a well. Maybe the campsite is haunted, or maybe there's a creature that lives in the well and kills inhabitants or kills anybody that stays the night there. Use your imagination. Whatever items, whatever stamps you put down in the campsite, in that region, in that area, think about how it's going to interact with your overall encounter, how your players are going to interact with the environment around them. Okay, now that we've added in that stuff, now that we've done encounter, let's go talk about texturing, because I know that you're looking at all this and saying, well, you've done all this texturing, but how did I do it? Well, I'll explain it to you. So let's go ahead and open up texturing, and we'll start first with the base texture that I used. And I used two base textures. The two base textures are dirt, which the entire land is made with the add mode of the mask tool. I've covered what I did is I covered the entire FG with the dirt. Then what I did is wherever there was trees or a bush or grass or whatever, I go ahead and added grass at a low opacity with a circle brush and a full softness. And then I just went around wherever there was wherever there was a bush, I'd add a little bit of grass there. There's a tree right here, so you notice I put some grass here. Okay, wherever there is some kind of organic trees, any kind of flora, I try to put a little bit of grass there. Kind of makes sense, right? And then the dirt is the base texture, right? Grass grows on top of dirt. So start with dirt on your FG as your base texture, and then grass. Add grass with a lower opacity around the regions that need the grass. So that's the base texturing, two textures. Let's go ahead and delete these real quick. So after that base texture, I also made a road texture, which I just use a stone wall. You'll notice that there is some road that kind of goes around like this. I've used that stone wall at a lower opacity. And also it works great as kind of, it's not just works as a wall, it works great as a little road. And I've kind of used it around the campfire because you don't want that fire catching any roots or anything on fire. So you put a little bit of stone wall texture underneath it, as you would kind of expect from a fire pit or wherever you put your campfire. And I put a little bit of stone around a little bit of that texture where the well is. So that is the texture I used for that. And again, just lower opacity, softness all the way up, and then just with kind of brush lightly with your mouse in the regions that you want that texture. The trick to blending is just lowering the opacity so that way it's not two textures side by side at 100% opacity and they clash. You want a soft, gradual transition between the two textures you're using to blend. Okay? After you've kind of done that road texture, I've also done some rocks, and I've used two textures when I do it. The first texture I lay down is this gray ground. I put that underneath the rocks. Wherever there's a rock at, I add that little gray ground. After I've done that, I apply the cracked ground texture, and the cracked ground kind of removes the flatness of the ground because it adds some cracks and crannies into the ground, giving it some more depth. So you'll notice that along here that I've got some cracked ground. See, the cracked ground is also here as well. Cracked ground is going to be an extremely helpful alpha texture, meaning that it only has the cracked part of the texture. The rest is alpha, transparent. So it will work on top of any assortment of textures that you have on the canvas. Okay, let's go ahead and remove that. Now, just like I did with the rock, I did something similar with the cliff texturing. I used the dirt because those cliffs or those cavern walls right there are brown. So whenever you're blending in stamps, find a similar texture or color that matches the similar color of the stamp. Okay, so I've done that with a lower opacity, remember, softness all the way, and just go wherever that stamp is, then apply that same cracked ground. And again, you'll have to scale to make sure that the cracked ground is not too large or too small. A general rule of thumb is if you're using 50 scale for a stamp, you can scale the textures down to 50% as well. That's not always the case, but it's a good rule of thumb so you don't accidentally have massive textures with massive artifacts in them, and then these tiny stamps. This is a common issue I see, so just remember, scale to the stamps with the textures. The last one is the detail texturing, and the detail texturing, I've used two types of textures. One, twigs and stones, which works great. I put them next to where these logs were. Clearly, these fallen trees have been ripped of all their branches for firewood for this camp. So that's why you've got vines growing over it. That's why there's not any branches coming out of them. And you'll see there's little sticks and stones right underneath. And you'll notice the sticks are brown, just like the logs are. And so it kind of creates this nice effect like, hey, I know what happened over there. That log got shaved of all its branches for the fire. That's why I've used twigs and stones. Wherever I've put a tree, I've also included another texture that's fallen leaves. You'll notice there's some fallen leaves there. Kind of makes sense. You're in the forest, doesn't matter what time of year it is. Coniferous trees, deciduous trees have leaves. They fall down. Strong winds, maybe something bumps into the tree and they just fall off. Maybe it's fall. Whatever it is, that's an extra alpha texture that you can throw down on top of or around your trees or bushes to show that, hey, there's some transition between the base textures and the trees. So that kind of goes over our texturing. Texturing, not complex, a lot easier than you think. Let's go, what's next on our thing? After we've done the texturing, we can go into details. The details is one of my favorite parts. You get to throw in stamps that kind of tell a story, okay? Whether you want to put all kinds of things. So let's go into details. With details, there's a couple things we'll throw in. There's quite a bit here, actually. For starters, we can start with the campfire first, and I'll make sure to put this up a layer. So in the details, next to the chopped wood, you've got an axe. Kind of makes sense, right? It's where the campfire is. It's where the wood is chopped. So adding an axe. You're at a camp, right? You might be thirsty. So throwing in maybe a cantina or a water jug is a good idea. And it's always nice to throw some things on the bedrolls. So I've added a guitar right here. Maybe one of your players is a bard. And I've also added a crossbow here. Now you don't have to throw down weapons that players are going to interact with if you don't want, but I throw them down. A little bit of extra detail kind of makes the map look really nice, but that's up to you how much detail you want to throw in. I've also thrown in a bucket next to the well. Kind of makes sense, right? And then I've thrown in a sword, an old rusted sword that's sticking into the log there. Now all these kind of details are really nice, and you can throw in all kinds of different details. It's up to you just how much detail you want to go, okay? Now that we finished details, let's go to the next one. Let's go into lighting, okay? Lighting is a lot of fun. I love lighting. Let's go over it. With lighting, I like to make sure that all the light stamps are on layer +5 of the Object Z list, okay? So you want to make sure they're on layer 5, because what we're going to end up doing is we're going to throw down a night filter, and that night filter will kind of diffuse or kind of ruin the light source. So we want the light sources, the lights, to be above the filter, and we want the night filter to be below the lights. So we'll cover that in just a moment. First, let's go over these lights first. And the way that I do my lighting, especially for a campfire, is there are 3 light sources that I use. I use 2 orange ones to get that orange warm glow that you kind of get from the fire. So I've used these 2. And then I used a yellow light, and I've made it larger, and I've dropped the opacity down so that way it kind of creates this transition between warm orangish light to this yellowish light. So it kind of has this more natural feel to it. So now that I've added those lights, let's go ahead and throw in the filters, and then we can go into some more advanced lighting and shadowing techniques for those of you who are already familiar with the tool. Let's go over filters real quick first. So like I said before, with filters, you're going to be using a night filter. So let's go ahead and turn them all off. Let's show what I mean by the night filter being on the right. One second here. Let's go in here. So if I turn on that night filter, the night filter is set to layer 4, while the light sources are set to -5. What happens if I push it down a layer? You see how once I put the light source below the filter, it kind of looks kind of wrong. So putting the light source above, there you go. And of course, you can make it larger if you want more light or less light. Just group all those lights together and then hold down the Shift key, mouse scroll wheel to make the light source bigger or smaller. Okay, that's up to you how much light that you want to have. Okay, let's cover real quick some advanced shadowing techniques and lighting techniques. So the first one is, let's go do shadows first. And you can use the path tool, like I said previously, to kind of create shadows. So let's go ahead and open that up real quick and I'll show you how I did this. Okay, let's go ahead and open these up real quick. Let me turn off shadows real quick and you can take a look at the difference, what it looks like without these path shadows. You see the difference? Okay, so remember, if you take any path, black, set the shadow to black, and then blur it, then you can use it to create a shadow that goes around something. Let me real quick show you what I mean by that. So let me go ahead and open up shadows real quick. I'm gonna go ahead and delete this shadow right here. And what you do is make sure it's set above whatever so I'm gonna put a shadow above. Make sure the path is above the rock. I'm gonna put it right here, like this. Just leave it alone, and there you go. And you'll notice that the shadow is going to project away from the light source. So let's quickly just show that real quick in an example. I'll go ahead and open it up real quick and kind of show it to you. One moment. Okay. There we go. There it is. So let's cover this real quick. So if the light source is right here, the shadow is going to be projecting away from the light source. So notice that the light is hitting against this rock. So the shadow is going to be right here. If the light source is right here and hitting this rock right here, the shadow is going to be projecting away from the light source. Okay? So that's the trick. Wherever the light source is, the shadow is going to be projecting away from that. Okay? All right. And now the other thing that you can do is you can create more lighting by using the same thing that I mentioned with the path, but create a yellow path and then also set it to blur in the overlay blend mode, and you can create glow. So let's go into lighting real quick, and I'll go ahead and select this and delete it real quick. And let me go ahead and turn on the opacity a bit. And remember, it's set to overlay. I've used an orangish shadow or orangish color, the same orangish value that the camp has. And then I just go ahead and place that same path right over the object. And I can go over it several times like this. And what I'm doing is creating this illusion that there is light going up against it. So see, I can put one right here too. Oopsie, my bad there. I can go in like this with, oopsie, my mistake. Come on now, there we go. I can take that shadow and I can apply it here to the log as well, right? So overlay blend mode, pick this relative value of whatever the shadow or the color of the fire or light source is, and you can apply that to those stamps as well. So kind of an advanced technique that you can use, okay? All right, let's go into the last bit of filters that we have here. I'm gonna throw down a texture filter called Old Paper. It's in Parchment World, and all it does is just add a little bit more artifacts to the ground, so that way you don't have to do any extra texturing. Why do this extra texturing when all you have to do is just throw down a filter that has some artifacts on it? So again, that Old Paper texture with the overlay blend mode works great. Let's also use a color filter called Clarity. That's going to cause it to pop out more. And I'm going to throw in a vignette, okay? And the vignette works great because the vignette creates a black shadow around the corners, and I want that because the light source is more centered. So I can bring that all the way up, and you'll see that those corners are nice and dark. Let me turn that off real quick and you can see, right? So by doing that, I kind of blacked out the edges, and that way the light source stays focused, or the focus stays on that campfire, because that's where the lightest light is that campfire. Okay, well, hey, that's it. Campsites are super easy to make. Just start with the center piece first, right? Where your players are going to be sleeping, the campfire. Then you can decide the terrain. You can decide the terrain just around the campsite. And then you can throw in make your terrain. You can throw in all the little tiny things that you want your players to encounter and interact with. And you want to throw in the details, the texturing, and then the light sources. And the simplest way with the lights, like I said, is you don't have to use any paths or anything. Just use the object shadows. Okay, if that's easier for you, just make sure the offsets, the X and Y offsets, are set to 0. That way it's a lot easier, okay? So hey, that's it. Super easy. Thank you so much for watching Campsites or watching the stream with me. Really glad that you're here. We just set up the new camp. Just set up the new, hold on a second, I'm getting tongue-tied here. We just put up the calendar for next month, for April. Definitely go check that out. You can see it right over here, actually. Let me open it up for you. What's new? Here we go. Yeah, so the newest updates, we added the April weekly map prompt calendar with all the different prompts. And then, of course, we've added it in the April stream calendar. Next week, we're going to be creating a fantasy regional city. I'm excited about that. That's going to be awesome. Then we also have top 10 world fails. We're going to be doing a whole series on castles, starting with hill forts all the way to the star forts. Okay, so we're going to be covering castles, and we're going to be doing one castle stream every month, covering every single castle that you can make. So I'm excited about that. And of course, the last stream next month will be top 10 battle map fails. Okay, hey, thank you so much. Hey, first time chatter. Thank you, Black Reza. Glad that you are here. Okay, that's it. Thank you, everybody. I kept this stream nice and short so that people won't be kept too long. Hey, thank you so much for watching. See you all next week. Please stay safe and healthy, and merry map making. All right, goodbye, everybody.